Oh, I love that song. That's the first time I'm hearing it. It's a song sung by Moshe Storch. He's singing Poseach es yadecha umasbia lechol chai ratzon. You open your hands and satisfy the needs of every living thing. It's how we say thank you to God. It's from Psalm 145, the Ashrei prayer we say 3 times a day. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this beautiful end of Tuesday as we head into the evening? I've had to adjust my prayer schedule. I used to do the afternoon mincha davening prayers after the class. Now I have to do them before because it usually turns dark while I'm teaching. We're in that time of the year. So who's with us? Paula Schmidt-Klauser is first with us from Chicago. James Roth from Indianapolis. Yehuda Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Juanita Morgan from Metro Atlanta. Welcome. Sandy McMurray from Michigan. Charlie Barkin says, what song is this? Now you know. Annie McGregor says, yippee, I made it. Nancy Brundemel writes, Southern Pines, North Carolina. Gwen Strong says, good evening. Stephen Giger from Dover, New Hampshire. Melissa Itel-Jurin. Good evening from Great Neck, New York. Lucy Ram Johnson from Minneapolis. Donna Smith from Bahama, North Carolina says, hello, y'all. Ronnie Boschwag is with us from Bozeman, Montana. Chaim Burke says, hi from Charlotte. Good and sweet year. Yes, we wish everybody Shana Tova Umetuka. Rosh Hashanah begins Friday night, and we wish each other a good year and a sweet year. Augusto Martin, shalom, pray for peace, we do. And Ayora says shalom from Merced, California. Bo Forrester from Toole, Texas. Amy Kulesa says peace and all good from Maryland. Laura Ray from Lake Shastina, California. Joel Jojo says hi. Sharon Baliti says shalom from London in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Sharon. Carl Baines from Bloomington, Illinois. Patrice Carter says hello, Sharon. Fran Brooks from Lebanon, New Jersey. Ross Hurd from Tucson. Nicholas Ackerman from Portland. Stephanie Marie Diaz says shalom aleichem. Nicholas Ackerman loves it. Sheila White from Carrollton, Kentucky. Priscilla Stevens Jacka from Chattanooga. Whew. Can I get through all of them? Marcella Schiffelin still on Olympic Peninsula. Martin Wade from Louisiana. Bonnie Kay from Austin, Texas. Faina from Louisiana or from LA, I'm not sure. Arnold Albin is in the house. Sarah McKay from Apple Valley. And Jonna Montillo says hi over on the YouTube side. Lynn with us from Texas, and Neil from Virginia. It's great to see you all, my holy sisters and brothers. Got some work to do. Where are we holding? This is episode number 255 of AT Daily. We're in Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. We are on Daf Lamed Zayin. That's page 37. We're in chapter 3, and today we'll conclude our discussion of the 8th Mishnah, Mishnah number 8 of chapter 3. When we ended yesterday, we were talking about establishing a conditional eruv. So an eruv is going to help us adjust our enclosure of holiness for Shabbos. It's going to enable us to walk further in the direction that we want to go, or to carry within an enclosure, so that we can delight in Shabbos, so we can fulfill our obligation. It's an obligation to delight in Shabbos, and we might get more delight out of Shabbos if we can join our friends at a Shabbos lunch, or if we can bring what we need for that lunch. Yesterday we were talking about a conditional eruv, and the case was that I make 2 eruvs at either end of my town, and because I don't know which direction this sage is coming. I've heard there's a sage coming to my town. He's going to give a Torah lecture tomorrow. I want to go out and meet him and greet him and walk in with him. Or the lecture is going to be actually outside of my Sabbath boundary. It's going to be more than 2,000 cubits away from my dwelling. So I need to extend the direction that I'm going to walk in. But I'm not sure if the sage is coming from the east or the west, and that's going to dictate, where I go to meet him in order to greet him, or where that lecture is going to be. So I'm not sure which direction I need to go. I just know that I'm going to need to go farther than 2,000 cubits from my dwelling. So before Shabbos, I make 2 eruvs, 1 in each direction, on the condition that if I hear from one of my friends tonight at Friday night services, which way the sage is coming from. If he's coming from the east, so I'm going to use my eruv in the east and I'm going to walk that way. Or if I hear that he's coming from the west, I'm going to use the eruv that I established toward the west and I'm going to walk that way. So that's a conditional eruv. Then we heard that you can even make it more complex, that 2 sages are coming, and they're coming from different directions. So I'm not sure which one I want to go greet or which lecture I want to go hear. I'm going to make 2 eruvs, and tomorrow I'll choose which one of these guys I want to go toward him. Rabbi Yehuda added the condition, the wrinkle to this condition, that if 2 sages are coming and one of them is my personal teacher, that I personally learned Torah from him, well then obviously my intention at the time that I created the eruvs was that when I hear which direction my teacher is coming from, well that's the direction I'm going to go. But the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda, and they said, well, you might want to go hear your teacher, but you might want to go hear the other sage who is your colleague. And we all know that we can learn just as much sometimes from our colleagues as we can from our masters, from the professor who's generations older than us. Yes, he has an incredible wealth of knowledge, and it would be great to learn from him, even if he's our teacher, or especially since he's our teacher. But sometimes it's better to learn with a colleague rather than just listening to that old man's lecture. I want to go to somebody who's more my generation, and we can dig into the material together, and we're going to end up learning more together than we would have if we were just listening to somebody else give us a lecture. Excuse me. Okay, so that's where we were yesterday. Okay. Now we have an issue. So Rabbi Yehuda said, right, if there's 2 teachers coming, and one of them, if there's 2 sages coming and one of them is my teacher, clearly I want to go there. But Rabbi Yehuda also said, if both of these sages who are coming are my personal teachers, then it's the same as if they weren't my teachers. I can choose tomorrow which eruv I want to make use of, which sage I want to go out and meet. Okay, but Rav says that we have a teaching from the sage Ayo, A-Y-O, and Ayo taught that Rabbi Yehuda said we may not make conditions about 2 things at once. So according to Rav says, according to this teaching of the sage Ayo, there must be a mistake in the Mishna. Because if Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, well, if both of them are my teachers, then I'll choose tomorrow. So it's like at the time that I choose tomorrow, I'm going to say that when I made the eruv, I intended to go that way. It's going to be like a retroactive designation. But he says, no, Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the principle of making conditions on 2 things at once. Rather, he may establish 2 eruvs, but only in the case that one sage is coming and we don't know which direction he's coming from. So the only unknown is which sage is coming from. When I set up my 2 eruvs, it was because I want to go hear that sage speak. I just don't know which direction he's coming from. But to say that, well, two sages are coming and I'll decide tomorrow who I really meant to create the eruv for, according to AO, Rabbi Yehuda would not say that. He would not say that. Therefore, it must be that according to AO, Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't accept this idea of making two conditions at once, it's because Rabbi Yehuda does not hold by, he does not accept the principle of retroactive designation. That's an important phrase in the Talmud. We're going to speak about it all day long today. All right, so who accepts retroactive designation and who rejects retroactive designation? It means that I decided not to decide at the time that I was supposed to decide. Rather, later, when I have more information, then I'm going to make my decision about a particular situation. But the decision that I make later is going to retroactively take hold in the past as if I made that decision at the time I was supposed to make it. If that's not clear, hopefully it'll get clear as we proceed. So, therefore, it must be that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold by retroactive designation. The Gemara says, but the Gemara says, but what are you talking about? Why do we need this case of two sages are coming in order to accept or not accept the principle of retroactive designation? Even if only one sage is coming and we don't know which direction he's coming from, right? We're going to find out after Shabbos begins. And at that time, I'm going to say, okay, he's coming from that way. So I established two eruvs, but the eruv that I really wanted was this one. So retroactively, right, I'm designating that eruv as my eruv, and that other one was just a basket of food because I want to go this way, but I don't know which direction until after Shabbos begins, and that's when I make my designation. So it must be that it was a retroactive designation. Rabbi Yochanan says no. In the case where two sages are coming to town, we don't know which, and we don't know which one we're going to choose. Then we just make our choice based on whatever, whatever criteria we decide which of these guys we want to listen to his lecture on Saturday. But in the case where only one sage is coming to town and we simply don't know which direction he's coming from, this is not a case of retroactive designation because the sage was already coming from one direction. It's just that I didn't know. I didn't know which direction he's coming from, but my designation at the time of making the eruv was whichever way he's coming from, that's my eruv. So I really did make the designation before Shabbos began. I just didn't know which way it was going to be, as opposed to the case where two teachers are coming. And what's my criteria for deciding? I'm going to decide later. Both of them were coming before Shabbos. They arrived, before Shabbos began. And everything happened, but I didn't make my choice till later. So it's the case of two sages coming. That's where it's retroactive designation. And according to our analysis so far, according to the sage Ao, Rabbi Yehuda does not accept the principle of retroactive designation. So, Rav says, therefore, because Rabbi Yehuda, as we've learned from this teaching, that the sage Ao says Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold by retroactive designation, and the Mishna says that Rabbi Yehuda says we can choose on Saturday which of the two sages we're going to go listen to if both of them are our personal teachers. It must be that the Mishna is wrong. This is the first time we're seeing this idea. Right? Usually, the Mishnah is the Mishnah. It's the teaching of earlier sages, the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period, right? Which is before the year 200 of the Common Era. And basically, it's like their word is gold. And the later sages, the Amoraim, who are active from like the year 200 to the year 600 more or less, and they're trying to figure out who said what and what was intended and what are we supposed to do based on the teachings of the sages who came before us. And it's unlike the scientific method, right? Where we assume that each new generation has more knowledge than the previous generation. In this case, we assume that each generation might have a little less access to the truth because the ultimate truth was revealed at Mount Sinai when God gave the Ten Commandments to the people and gave the Torah to Moses. So the previous generations are actually assumed to know more. But in this case, we're saying, well, something went wrong. The Tanaim may know more, but the Mishnah somehow got recorded wrong. There's an error in the Mishnah, says the Gemara. According to Rav, right? Rav says, reject the Mishnah. And then the Gemara says, well, why should we reject the Mishnah? Why don't we reject this teaching of the sage Eo? Maybe the Mishnah is correct and he's wrong. And then the Gemara answers, it shouldn't enter your mind to reject Eo's teaching because the Mishnah must be wrong. Why? Because it conflicts with other earlier teachings. We have other sources that show that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold by retroactive designation. So the next teaching is a Tosefta. Okay, so a Tosefta is one of those earlier teachings. Mishnah, Baraisa, or Tosefta, these are earlier teachings of the Tanaim. The Mishnahs, though, are the ones that are supposed to be like the most authoritative. But still, Baraisas and Toseftas have a lot of authority, just not quite as much as a Mishnah. So usually if it's Mishnah versus Tosefta, we go with the Mishnah. But when there's multiple teachings sort of lined up against a Mishnah, that's when the Amoraim say, wait a minute, we have to be careful here. So the Tosefta says, Rabbi Meir says, one may do the following. So Rabbi Meir teaches that the following procedure is permissible. If a person buys wine from a kuti is a Kuthian. We learned about Kuthians the other day. They were another people who were living in the land of Israel. There was a time where they were sort of forced to convert to Judaism, but their heart wasn't in it, and they sort of pulled back and away from it. And so even though they hold by some teachings of the Torah, they don't hold by all of them. They don't accept the authority of the sages. They're not Jews. And therefore, we can certainly not trust that they're going to tithe produce according to the laws of the Torah, right? So if we buy wine from them, we should assume that it has not been tithed properly, and therefore it's on us to tithe it. Same principle as when we buy wine from an Am Haaretz, a Jew who is ignorant of the Torah laws. So when we buy from him, he might have tithed it, he might have not. That's called demai, uncertainly tithed produce, or in this case, wine. And so we need to tithe it. We need to assume that it has not been tithed. In other words, the tithes have not been removed from it. Okay, so we bought wine from a kuti, and now we have to remove the tithes from it before we drink it. But Rabbi Meir says, okay, you can actually do this a little differently. Rather than separate the 2% of the wine that you brought, imagine that you bought the wine in a barrel. So there's a bunch of wine. And you're supposed to take the first 2%, 1/50th, that's the teruma gedola, you set this aside for the priest. And then the next 10% of what's in that barrel is the Meiser Rishon, the first tithe, which goes to the Levite. And then 10% of what's left, so 90% is left more or less, and you take 10% of that, and that's the Meiser Sheni, that's the second tithe that we're supposed to keep for ourselves, but we can only consume it in Jerusalem during a festival, when we make a festival pilgrimage. We don't have to carry that wine to Jerusalem, we can redeem it for money. So, says Rabbi Meir, the first two tithes, the 2% for the priest and the 10% for the Levite, I verbally declare that I have set it aside, and I'm going to stop drinking this wine when 10% is left, or 11%, 12%, whatever it is, the final amount, we're going to leave it in the barrel, and we're going to turn that over to the priest and to the Levite, and the amount that we redeemed for money, I'm going to set aside the money so that I can spend that in Jerusalem during a festival pilgrimage. Therefore, I can start drinking the wine now. Even though I haven't physically separated those tithes, I have verbally designated that they're separate. I'm going to just leave them in the barrel, what's left at the end. I'm going to stop drinking before I reach that amount. And that's going to be the tithes at the end. So I'm just going to start drinking it now, says Rabbi Meir. But Rabbi Yehuda, along with Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon, but importantly here, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Why? Because while you're drinking, you are drinking untithed produce. You're going to be drinking both from your own portion and what is really the tithed part. And it's only because when you reach the end, you're going to say that what's left in here now is the portion of the wine that was present at the beginning when I started drinking. Verbally designated would be there at the end, but really you're making a retroactive designation, and Rabbi Yehuda does not hold by retroactive designation. So therefore, we have a proof that Rabbi Yehuda does not hold by retroactive designation, and apparently neither does Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon. Ula says, Ula is a sage who was well known, and a Mora, right, so of the later period, who would go from, or maybe he's a Tana actually. But anyway, what he was known for, he was a sage who traveled back and forth between the Holy Land and Babylonia. He was important because he was the one who was, pollinating. He was like pollinating the two communities with the teachings from each other, right? They didn't have internet, they didn't have telephone, they didn't have telegram, the mail system wasn't very good either. So Ula was reliable that he would learn the teachings of the sages in the Holy Land and memorize them and share them with the community in Babylonia, and he would learn their teachings and memorize them and repeat them reliably to the community in Israel. Ula says, actually, we should reject Ao rather than the Mishna. Right, so already this is what we're arguing about. It's the sage Ao who says, well, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold by retroactive designation, and so we're trying to say that the Mishnah was wrong. Ula says, no, actually the Mishnah is correct. Ao is the one who was wrong. Why? Because the Tosefta that we're using as a proof to show that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold by retroactive designation, this Tosefta has been recorded inaccurately. The Tosefta is being stated with an error in it. What is the error? It's that Rabbi Yehuda sides with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that you can make this verbal designation at the beginning of drinking the wine, that what's left at the end will serve as the tithe. And so retroactively, when we get to the end, we'll say that the wine that's left in here now is the wine we separated at the beginning, and it's now here. So Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Meir. It's Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon who don't hold by retroactive designation, but Rabbi Yehuda does, which would therefore reinstate our Mishnah as being accurate. Now the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. Now you're saying that Rabbi Yosei does not hold by retroactive designation. And is it true that Rabbi Yosei rejects retroactive designation? Don't we have another teaching that if two women have given birth, and the Torah commands that after a woman gives birth, she brings certain offerings at the temple? You know, it's an offering of gratitude that I survived my pregnancy, my baby survived my pregnancy. We all know that that's not a given even in the modern world, but in the ancient world, I mean, you know, tragically, so many women died in childbirth, so many babies died in childbirth. So this offering of thanksgiving, part of the offering is a bird, right? So you make a bird offering. So if two women gave birth and both of them are going up to the temple in Jerusalem and they want to bring their offerings and they bought birds for that purpose, but they only had one cage between them and the birds became mingled and they don't know which woman bought which bird. Now, since they're bringing an important offering, an offering of thanksgiving for a successful childbirth, you know, when they bought the bird, they designated, that's my bird for my offering, for my, you know, giving thanks to the Lord that I and my baby came through this. And now the birds have become mingled and they don't know which bird is which. So we have a teaching that it's okay, don't worry about it, don't sweat it. The priest who's going to accept the birds and bring them up as an offering on the altar in the temple the priest can decide which bird was for which woman, and the priest can retroactively say, whichever bird was selected by the woman at the beginning, this is the bird that is for her, and it's retroactive to the beginning, and so it's okay. It's done. We don't have to worry about it. And Rabbi Yosei is the one who holds that way. So clearly, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosei must accept the principle of retroactive designation. Another proof that Rabbi Yosei holds by retroactive designation is the case in which an am haaretz, an ignoramus, right, one who doesn't know the Torah laws that well and doesn't care that much, says to a chaver, as we've seen, right? So an am haaretz is an ignoramus. A chaver is a friend, but in the Talmud has a specific meaning of a friend of that community of ultra pious individuals who are meticulous about Torah observance, particularly the process of tithing. So the am haaretz says to the chaver, right, the one who doesn't care much about Torah and religion and faith, he's a Jew, but he doesn't care very much, and he says to the chaver, who's meticulous, when you go to the market, please purchase some produce for me, because I heard you're going to go purchase from Bob, so when you get from Bob, please get some for me too. Bob is another am haaretz, another ignoramus. So we can assume that Bob, because he's an ignoramus and am haaretz, he didn't tithe that food properly. The chaver would never assume that this produce was already tithed on Bob's farm. So the chaver, once he buys it from Bob, he's going to tithe it as if it's never been tithed. The question is, the part that the portion of the produce that he's now going to buy on behalf of this other am haaretz, let's call him Chuck, does he have to tithe that as well? Does he have to tithe for himself and the part that he's going to be turning over to this other am haaretz? That's the question. And the ruling is, according to Rabbi Yosei, that he need not tithe what he turns over to this other guy. Why? Because it's like when he bought a whole bunch of produce, right? It all went into his shopping bag, right? And it's all mingled together. But retroactively, we're designating that the part that was intended for Chuck, right? The guy who sent him said, please buy some for me when you're buying from Bob. It was like always separated. It was always kept separate, and he just has to give it over to him. And what he does with it is his business. That guy's his business. This guy's his business. The chaver is only interested in that what he buys for himself ends up tithed properly. And the rabbis disagree with this, and they say that in this situation, the chaver must tithe not only the part that he's going to keep, but also the portion of the produce that he's going to turn over to Chuck, this other ignoramus, this other am haaretz. Why? Because he bought it. He gave money to Bob. He bought a bunch of produce. He now owns it. So even if he's going to, give it over to that guy, he needs to tithe what has come into his possession, even if he was always intending to transfer it to the other guy. There is an exception to this. If Chuck gave him money to go buy from Bob, not just get it for me and I'll pay you back, but here's some money and buy it for me. So then right away there was a designation. Here, this is how much Chuck wants. I'm giving you Chuck's money. So even if they mingle in the bag, it's clear that an amount was always separated for Chuck. And in that case, the chaver won't have to tithe the portion that he turns over there. In any case, Rabbi Yosei seems to hold by retroactive designation, since the chaver bought and turned over without tithing to Chuck, to this am haaretz. The Gemara says, actually reverse the opinions, right? Again, this teaching was taught wrong. You can see there's all this confusion in a whole series of teachings about who holds what. And now the Gemara is going to say, you need to reverse the opinions. Rabbi Yosei rejects retroactive designation, and the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yosei, they accept retroactive designation. So it's according to Rabbi Yosef that the haver needs to tithe even what he turns over to them. It's the rabbis who said in the situation where he says, just get some from me, I'll pay you back. He does it, he turns it over. The rabbis say he doesn't have to tithe that. Rabbi Yosef says he does. Rava says to Rav Nachman, who is the Tana, this sage of the earlier generations, who is the Tana who doesn't accept retroactive designation even for rabbinic decrees? When we're talking about the tithing process and using retroactive designation to figure out when the tithe became, when did one become liable to separate the tithe? And I'm going to say in the future that I'm going to retroactively designate at the beginning, at that point when I became liable, as if I separated then, etc. That's a Torah obligation. Tithing is a Torah obligation. We've been talking about eruv. Eruv is a rabbinic decree. There's nothing in the Torah about eruv. As we've learned yesterday and the day before, an eruv is a rabbinic construct. So now the Gemara is suggesting, well, maybe some people say there's no retroactive designation for Torah laws like tithing, but there is retroactive designation for rabbinic decrees like eruv. Is that the distinction that we're making? Is what we're asking now? So Rava says to Rav Nachman, look at the case that I'm going to share with you. I'm not sure who is the Tana, but this is a person who must reject retroactive designation even for rabbinic decrees. What is the case? There was a baraisa. In the baraisa, in this earlier teaching, a person says, I am establishing an eruv. I'm establishing it on behalf of one of these 5 people. And tomorrow, on Shabbos, I'm going to decide which of the 5 people I meant to establish it for. And that one can make use of the eruv, but the other ones can't. So before Shabbos begins, this person creates an eruv, but he hasn't said who it's for. Remember that for an eruv to be valid, you actually have to just designate who is going to be included in the eruv. And he's saying, well, it's only going to be one out of a possible 5 people, and I'm going to pick that one tomorrow. So this is clearly retroactive designation, very clear-cut case of retroactive designation. Says the baraisa, if he chooses one of those 5 people before Shabbos begins, right? So now it's not really retroactive designation. If he chooses one of those people before Shabbos begins, that's the moment when he establishes the eruv. It's a valid eruv. But if he waits until after Shabbos begins to choose one of those 5 people, that's retroactive designation. And according to this baraisa, the eruv is no good, not valid. The retroactive designation does not work. So remember, Rava brought this question to ask Rav Nachman, who is this Tana who said that this doesn't work? He's asking, does Rav Nachman know who was the Tana who said this and says that the retroactive designation doesn't work even in the case of eruv? Rav Nachman was silent. The Gemara says, well, the Tana, therefore, must be somebody who holds like the sage Ao in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who apparently does not hold by retroactive designation in the case of an eruv, right? So it must be, it's Rabbi Yehuda, or the people who hold like Rabbi Yehuda, according to the sage Ao, that Rabbi Yehuda says no retroactive designation in the case of an eruv. Rav Yosef says, no, you're misunderstanding this whole thing. Do you think that there's no other Tanaim in the world that we could look to than Rabbi Yehuda? There's lots of people, and we can name a Tana who rejects retroactive designation even for a rabbinic decree like eruv. Okay, what is the case? Rav Yosef brings the case in a baraisa. A person says, I'm establishing this eruv right here. He's not talking during Shabbos. He's saying during the week, I'm going to make this eruv, and it's going to be good for all the Shabbats of the coming year. It's for every Shabbos this coming year. And on any particular Shabbos, If I want to use the eruv, I will walk in the direction that the eruv allows me to walk in. And if I don't want to use the eruv, I won't walk. That's what this person says when he establishes the eruv. So the Baraisa continues that if this person, realizes that intention to use the eruv, that he wants to walk, as he put it, but he formulates that thought in his mind before Shabbos begins, that on this Shabbos I'm going to make use of the eruv that I set up, months ago. On this Shabbos I'm going to use it. Then it's a good eruv. But if he doesn't formulate that desire to make use of the eruv to walk in that direction until after Shabbos begins, then that would be a case of retroactive designation for this particular Shabbos. And according to this Baraisa, no good. That eruv is no good. He needed to formulate his desire to use it before Shabbos begins, not after Shabbos begins. The Gemara and who says that? Rabbi Shimon says it's valid, right? That he can formulate his desire to make use of the eruv on Shabbos. And the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Shimon, and they say, no. He needed to make up his mind that he was going to use the eruv before Shabbos begins. So in this case, it seems like Rabbi Shimon holds by retroactive designation, and the rabbis who dispute him do not. They reject retroactive designation. The Gemara says this is another teaching where the holdings were reversed. Reverse the opinions. Rabbi Shimon, as we've heard before, rejects retroactive designation, and the rabbis who dispute him, the rabbis generally accept the principle of retroactive designation. Then the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. Why should we reverse the opinions? Maybe Rabbi Shimon says no retroactive designation for Torah laws like tithing, but he accepts retroactive designation for a rabbinic decree like an eruv. And Rav Yosef comments on this, no. When it comes to the principle of retroactive designation, you're all in or you're all out. If you accept retroactive designation, you accept it for both Torah laws and rabbinic decrees. If you reject retroactive designation, you reject it for both Torah laws and rabbinic decrees. All in or all out. Rava says, all of these teachings now are based on the fact that you had this tithing process where you made a verbal designation on the wine that you bought from a Katian, and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda said you can make that verbal designation, and in a sense accepting retroactive designation of what's left at the end, that was the tithe that should have been taken at the beginning. And Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon, they don't hold by retroactive designation, and that's why they reject this idea, because you can't decide at the end which portion of the wine was going to become the tithe and just leave it till the end. Rava says, no. The reason that they rejected that process, that Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Shimon rejected that process, is not that they reject retroactive designation, but rather that when it comes to tithing, and in this case, tithing wine, you have to separate first. You have to separate it first. Why? Because if you don't separate it first, you don't have clearly recognizable stuff that you can take from, right? In other words, once you tithe it, okay, it's tithe produce, it's acceptable. If you don't tithe it, or if you make this verbal designation to tithe it later, you don't have a clear distinction between what's been tithed and what hasn't. It's tevel. It's as if it's awaiting tithing. And a person could come along who doesn't know, what your tithing process was, and he could drink and throw this whole thing off. So it's not about retroactive designation. It's just that they hold, when it comes to tithing, you need to take the tithe first. You can't do that later. So that what's tithed and what's not tithed remains distinct and recognizable. I'm almost at the very end. If you have questions or comments, put them in the comments now. And the rabbis said to Rabbi Meir on this issue, right? Rabbi Meir says, we can do that. We don't have to worry about making the tithes distinct, and we can make this verbal designation, etc. And the rabbi said to Rabbi Meir, don't you concede that if you go through this procedure that you have said is permissible, of verbally designating that part of this wine is for the tithing, and it's just going to be there at the end of us drinking from the barrel, whatever's left, and we're going to make sure there's enough, that's what we meant to separate at the beginning. Don't you concede, Meir, that if the flask breaks, if the flask bursts, then they never got around to having the tithe available at the end, and it would turn out retroactively that the person was drinking what should have been what actually belonged to the priest. Don't you concede, Meir, that before we reach the end of your procedure, if the flask bursts, that we won't be able to get to the end, and it will turn out that this person strayed and violated a Torah obligation? And Rabbi Meir's classic answer is not, oh, okay, I concede, but rather, when the flask breaks, then we'll talk about it. When the flask breaks, when the flask bursts, I think is the word, then we can discuss. But that is so unlikely to happen that we don't have to discuss that super unlikely condition. It's an unusual thing to find that kind of near sarcasm in the Talmud, because they discuss all the time cases that are super unlikely to happen. But in this case, I guess maybe Rabbi Meir was tired, and that's it. When the flask breaks, then we can talk about it. Until then, I hold that you can make the verbal designation. Yehuda agrees with him. He accepts retroactive designation. Yosei and Shimon disagree with him. Maybe they reject retroactive designation. Maybe they don't. We're not sure. They might have rejected this process for a different reason. But it seems that generally speaking, this concept of retroactive designation can be used unless there's a reason not to use it. Okay, let us look at comments and questions. Ed Berg. This reminds me of my bar mitzvah at the Kotel, at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, the holiest place in the world. My dad bought a case of wine in Jerusalem, but we couldn't drink it because it turned out to be non-kosher. Who knew one could buy non-kosher wine in Israel? Ugh! Now, of course, kosher, it's a different kettle of fish. When it comes to wine, it's not so... there is a tithing process even in modern times. I'm not going to go into that. But kosher wine has very specific requirements. The chief one is that kosher wine needs to be supervised by a Shomer Shabbos Jew, the whole procedure, the whole process of making the wine. In modern times, why is that so important? This is very much a tradition that took hold, and we obey it because it's been there for such a long time. Originally, why was this so important? Because there were idolaters in the world, and it was very common practice among idolaters that they would pour wine on their idol as an offering to their idol. And if wine had been offered as a libation by an idolater to his idol, to his god, then a Jew could absolutely never participate or even benefit from that wine ever. And so to make sure that the wine we drink was never used in any possible way as a libation for an idol, it's guarded from beginning to end, and that's one of the important requirements of kosher wine. Yosef Shum. What is the difference between a Tosefta and a Baraisa? And Mishna is most authoritative. Correct. Yes, you got it. What is the difference between a Baraisa and a Tosefta? I'm not sure at this moment. They're both earlier teachings. I forget what is their provenance exactly. Baraisas are really similar to Mishnahs, but for whatever reason, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi edited the Mishnah, he left those out, right? He took the most authoritative teachings and he said, this is the Mishnah. He's not saying ignore the rest. He's saying like this is the most authoritative, but as we're teaching it and learning it and struggling over it and poring over it and arguing over it, we can bring in these baraisas and toseftas and other kinds of teachings to figure out exactly what's going on in the Mishnah. Where exactly the tosefta comes from, I'm just not sure at this moment. This is the kind of general knowledge I wish I had and was always ready to answer, and I'm just not ready to answer at this moment. Okay. So somebody in the comments was wondering if the Talmud is always this dry, and a lively discussion ensued. And some of the comments on that, Bill Eldridge said, well, yes and no. The structural stuff forms the backbone on which the deeper mystical learning grows, like a trellis for grapes. Bill, you're a poet. I know you're studying in the getting a doctorate in religion. I forget exactly what you're getting it in at Berkeley, but what a beautiful way to put it. It's exactly right. We always want to be inspired. We want to hear stories that are inspiring. We want to hear teachings that are all about the way that we should behave, etc. Yes, but all of that is in the context for a Jew of fulfilling his obligations, right? And there are many obligations in the Torah that God said, do this, do this, do this, do this. And there's no rational reason why we need to do it. We just need to do it. And in order to do it and not fail to do it, we have to know exactly what our obligations are. And so, yeah, we spent a lot of time just studying what the obligations are, even in cases that are never going to come up. Even when it comes to, the laws of what a high priest has to do at Yom Kippur. I mean, we're going to spend a whole volume of that, Tractate Yoma. I'm never going to be responsible for the high priest obligations. I'm not a priest. But we study it because it's all Torah and we must know it. And like so many things in this world, if somebody tells you this is an important discipline, and all the more if God tells you, you just do it. And there are going to be many days when you don't know why you're doing it. But if you stay with it day after day, eventually you realize, oh, God is good, and he told me to do these things for a reason, because unexpected outcomes from that diligent Torah study will result. Unexpected days where you have mystical insights, ethical insights, legal, practical, all kinds of insights that come because you put in the time. And Christine said, I listen on my evening walk and I look for the little nuggets. What's TBH? I should know what that means. To be sure? I'm not sure. I've listened to other podcasts of Daf Yomi, and Sal does a terrific job breaking it down for us. Thank you so much, Christine. And Augusto Martin says, the minute details, it's what I love about it. To me, it shows the work that it takes to demonstrate an absolute dedication to God. Rochelle Rosen says, yes, and Sal breaks it down well. Much of this isn't relevant, but later it makes sense. So you're getting the same answer from all of us. And Amy Kulesa says, it seems that it's about dedicated intention, this teaching. We make the intention before the action, not afterwards. Right. So much of it is about understanding. And that, this question comes up, right, in politics all the time, like especially with corruption trials, What do you know and when did you know it? Being able to break down a question like that, not just, what are the two sides of the argument, but what is the history of the argument? I mean, how important is that? When you look at politics today, and we never talk politics here, this is a safe haven from politics. But just as a general principle, when we're trying to figure out who we agree with, who we're against, what law is good for the people, what law is bad for the people, you can't just study that according to what policy is being offered right now. Always we have to look at laws in terms of the context of their history, what the legislators were trying to accomplish, what the problem was in the nation or in the state or in the city that the law was trying to address. Certainly, judges have to take all these matters into consideration so that they can make a just ruling. And likewise, if we're just a parent adjudicating a dispute between two children who are fighting, we shouldn't just jump in and say share, or just jump in and say, oh, okay, you've had it, you take it. Like, you really got to get the story. How did this dispute arise? And what were the assumptions that the two children were making about who is entitled to the object and when, etc. You got to really dig down, and you got to be ready to be a little bit granular with every important question in life. And for sure, this kind of learning is training for that. My pals, it's great to learn with you, and God willing, we'll continue again tomorrow, Wednesday. Let me note that on Thursday, class is going to be earlier, 1 hour early, not tomorrow, Wednesday, but on Thursday. I'm a guest on Robert Stern's podcast, so I got to make our class just 1 hour early. That should be an interesting podcast for those who know who Robert Stearns is. All the best, and God willing, we'll learn again